My name is Isis Howard, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Sarah Quadra Vargas and Emma Pelton, as well as our Western Monarch Count co-founder and regional coordinator of the North Bay, Mia Monroe, our Monarch Maven. And so we're just thrilled to announce the news with you. So before we announce the totals, I wanted to go over how we get the numbers for the annual Western Monarch Count. So every year since 1997, when the count started, community scientists and conservation professionals have joined forces via the Western Monarch Count, or WMC, to monitor the overwintering Western monarch sites. Surveys are conducted at the same times each year. These are the official monitoring periods, and this year we added a new one, and it was the early season count. And we're really excited to share the details with that with you and continue doing that moving forward to capture some of the arrivals at overwintering sites. And then we also conduct virtual and field survey trainings for our volunteers and participants so that they understand the standardized protocols that we use and vet the data with to maintain a standardized data set, allowing us to compare populations across years and regions. So while we do accept data from across the entire overwintering season from October through February, March, and regardless of protocols, we do vet the WMC data, which we'll be announcing today, according to these protocols so that they can be better compared. And none of this would be possible without the dedication of our regional coordinators, volunteers, as well as Xerces partners and funders. The work and efforts and resources as a result of the combined dedication of these groups has been really vital in assessing the migratory monarch population in Western North America, and it's paved the path for more effective conservation measures as well. So this year's count tally is in, and unfortunately, it is the second lowest overwintering population ever recorded. It's only slightly better than the all-time low of less than 2,000 monarchs in 2020, and it represents a 96% decline from last year. Next slide. And so we'll announce the numbers in the next slide, but the last piece of contextual information I want to provide to you is that, again, these numbers represent the Western overwintering monarch population, which is different from the Eastern monarch population. So the Western monarch population is geographically distinct from Eastern monarchs that overwinter in central Mexico each year. They're separated by the Rocky Mountains, but we do know from tagging efforts in the past that there is some exchange and interchange between the two populations. And like their eastern counterparts, the Western monarch migration takes place over multiple generations of butterflies, and the Western monarch's final generation primarily overwinters in clusters, sheltered in tree groves along the California coast into northern Baja, Mexico, and then we have a few inland sites in California and Arizona as well. And with that, let's get to the part that you're all here for. Next slide. So this year's early season count revealed 7,601 monarch butterflies across 202 overwintering sites. This monitoring period ran from October 19th through November 3rd. It was a 2-week monitoring period in the early season. Again, it's the first of its kind, so we don't have anything to compare it to besides anecdotal evidence. And the mid-season count from November 16th through December 8th, 2024, revealed 9,119 monarch butterflies across 257 overwintering sites. So the same number of overwintering sites monitored in last year's mid-season count. And this mid-season number really represents the peak of overwintering Western monarchs. This mid-season count is the number we typically use when we track the population tallies over time. And then the late season count is still being vetted, again, according to protocols, but the number is going to be approximately 5,200 monarchs. So that number will be refined and finalized as we finish data vetting and collecting all the data from the late season count. But this is the general picture we've seen over this last year's overwintering season. And right now it's the end of January. We're about to head into February, and we typically see monarchs start to disperse from their overwintering sites in that February and March zone. And you can see from the numbers here that in the early season, we saw, the arrival of monarchs, and then that number increased, a little under 2,000 up to the mid-season kind of peak. And then it dropped back off for the late season down to 5,200 or so. So the early season to mid-season kind of uptick was like about 11% increase. And so it'll be a bit more of a drop off heading to late season. And that's because, overwintering monarchs are arriving and their migrations may take different amounts of times. And so most of them have aggregated by that mid-November, late November mark. And then by late season, depending on weather, predation, available milkweed and other nectar resources, etc., monarchs may either, start moving around, dispersing, or they often, like some of them, face mortality events either from predation or other factors. So this is the typical trend we see, but the numbers are really stark in that it's a very significant drop off again, similar to that one that we saw in 2020. So next slide, please. This next slide shows the graph of mid-season Western Monarch counts over time. So again, we're capturing that kind of peak group from 1997 to present. And so we don't have as many years of data for the late season monitoring efforts or the early season, but we do have 28 years of mid-season counts, which allows us to kind of make these population estimates. And so what we can see from this graph is that although the blue line, which represents the number of sites monitored on that right-hand y-axis, the blue line generally goes upwards, meaning more sites are monitored. So back in 1997 through, 2010, we had less than 150 monarch sites monitored. From 2010 to present, a lot of times we're above 200 and a lot of times we're above 250 sites. So we're monitoring more sites. We have more volunteers, more eyes on the ground, and yet the numbers are going down. And what we don't capture in this map, in this graph, are the records from the 80s and prior. And so the records from the 80s and prior also suggest even more monarch butterflies in the low millions, clustering and overwintering on the West Coast. So 1997 shows a little over 1 million butterflies here, but then there were even more in the 80s and prior. And nowadays we're facing this kind of like bouncing around numbers, which are represented by the green bar graphs, the total monarchs reported during that mid-season count. And Sarah, if you could click one more time, or two more times actually. So what we see are the 2024 numbers of 9,119 monarchs looks similar to that 2020 downturn of 1,901 monarchs. And a lot of people ask us, they're like, is it just because COVID that the numbers went down? And it's like, no, if you look at the graph, we actually surveyed almost 250 sites for that 2020 time. And then now we have another, a low, near record low count tally, and we surveyed over 250 sites this year. And this trend is typical with smaller populations, and we'll get into that a bit later. But next slide, please. The next question we always get is like, what could have possibly caused these low numbers? And also, how do the numbers jump back up? And so we'll get into that with this slide. So the primary possible causes that we're thinking happened this year include the record heat waves across the globe, but also in the West, drought impacts on our landscapes, and nectar and milkweed resources for monarchs during the summer and fall breeding seasons. And then we'll talk about the bounciness of butterflies, which is kind of getting at that natural fluctuation from year to year. So first off, with the record heat waves, you can see in this map here from the NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information at www.climate.gov. What we're looking at is the July 2024 temperatures compared to normal. So a normal temperature would look white. The red areas look red, or the hotter than average temperatures look red, and then blue areas are cooler than average temperatures. So last July during, breeding season, we see that the West and the coastal edge of the East Coast in the United States have a lot of red, signifying that they were warmer than average temperatures. And so for our Western monarchs, which are divided by that Rocky Mountain range, most of their habitat was experiencing higher than average temperatures. Sarah, if you could click one more time. Additionally, this map talks about drought. So the Palmer Z index map, in combination with their hydrological drought index, shows that short-term drought occurred across much of the Western United States. Moderate to exceptional drought covered about 47% of the Pacific Northwest in July of 2024. And drought significantly impacts monarch butterflies by reducing the availability of milkweed, which is their primary host plant for egg laying, and nectar producing flowers, which are crucial for adult monarchs to fuel their long migrations and their breeding, which can and probably did lead to some decrease in reproduction and survival rates, leading into the overwintering generation. So these numbers and the possible causes, it's really concerning. So we already know that small populations, especially of invertebrates, are especially vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. And we think that's what happened this year. So the record high late summer temperatures and drought in the West likely contributed to this drop off in the third and fourth monarch breeding generations. And then Sarah, if you click one more time. So according to a book called Monarchs in a Changing World, they talk about a study where they researched what the lethal and sublethal effects of high temperatures are on breeding monarch butterflies. And so if you're like me, you don't know Celsius to Fahrenheit conversions offhand, but we've put this little pop-up here. So basically, the monarch butterflies have an upper thermal limit of about 42 degrees Celsius or 107.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But they experience sublethal effects like lower survival, growth, etc., development time, and adult size. They experience those sublethal effects at 38 degrees Celsius, which is 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, according to this study. So, take these numbers with a grain of salt, but we experienced in the West a lot of temperatures this past summer and fall over 100 degrees. So again, these numbers may contribute. And Sarah, if you could click one more time. Going to the bounciness of butterflies, which is a blog that Emma Pelton and Elizabeth Crone and Cheryl Schultz had put out a few years ago in 2021, following the 2020 record low and then the uptick of 2021, they put out this blog to try to explain why and how monarch numbers bounce around like this. So I really recommend you check out the blog, but the gist of it is that we know that monarch butterfly populations and other insects are naturally bouncy and that they fluctuate from year to year in response to temperature, rainfall, availability of food, and other factors. So again, these record heat waves and drought contribute to all these factors that affect the bounciness of butterflies and contribute to that. So are we surprised? Maybe not, but it's still very disheartening. And I've heard from some of you of like, well, how many years of this can monarchs take, right? Um, and if we look back at the climate data, what it shows also is that um, July of last year marked the 14th consecutive month of record high global temperatures. And the past 10 Julys have been the warmest Julys on record, highlighting some of the impacts of climate change in the last decade. And so some of these big issues, which is pointed out in that study from that book, Monarchs in a Changing World, are that unusually strong and long-lasting heat waves, like unrelenting heat without periodic cool downs, poses a big threat because periodic cool downs will offer that relief to monarchs even when there's a few days of high temperatures. But if we have constant high temperatures and drought, that can lead to long-term effects on populations like the monarch butterfly. All right, next slide, please. So going back to the numbers a little bit, I wanted to point out some key regions and sites before I hand it off to Emma Pelton to discuss some of the newer conservation news related to the proposed ESA listing. And so the top sites of this year were a little surprising. In my time at Xerces, I've typically seen the high counts in Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo. So I was like, oh my gosh, look at the Bay Area and Santa Cruz standing out this year. Lighthouse Field State Park, the Natural Bridges State Beach, and Moran Lake of Santa Cruz County all held the top 3 counts during the midseason. Lighthouse Field and Natural Bridges were the only overwintering sites with over 1,000 butterflies inhabiting them this year. And then Pismo Beach Monarch Butterfly Grove had the 4th highest count for midseason with 556 monarchs, and SkyWest Golf Course in the Bay Area had the 5th highest monarch overwintering site count. So that was really interesting and surprising a little bit. I mean, Pismo's usually in there, so that one maybe isn't as surprising, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that one included in the top 5. And then if we look at a regional perspective, the top counties where monarchs were overwintering were in Santa Cruz County as number 1. That hosted about 45% of the total population this year. The second largest county was San Luis Obispo with about 24% of this year's population, and Alameda County had about 12.4% of the population. These were the only 3 counties in California that had numbers in the thousands for overwintering monarchs. Then Santa Barbara County, Monterey County, and Marin County were the only 3 counties with hundreds of butterflies overwintering. They all represent less than 10% of the overwintering population this year. But these 2 tables represent the top 6 counties where monarchs were overwintering. And then the rest of the regions had under 100 monarch butterflies observed over the entire county or region. Next slide, please. And so if you're interested in looking at the data in a little more detail, you can go to our website, westernmonarchcount.org, and look at our data page. And with that, I'll hand it over to Emma Pelton.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposed listing of the monarch as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And before I begin, I'm just going to caveat that I am not the Fish and Wildlife Service, so take everything I say with that caveat, and please reach out to your local office if you have specific questions. But I just wanted to provide an overview. This has been in the news a lot lately. If you can advance to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background. This has been a long time in the making. A petition was submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service to continue to consider the monarch as threatened over a decade ago, back in 2014. And the petitioners included the Center for Biological Diversity, Center for Food Safety, the Xerces Society, and the late monarch scientist, Dr. Lincoln Brower. So in 2020, the service found that the monarchs warranted, which means that they qualified for listing under the Endangered Species Act, but were precluded from that listing by higher priority species. So this is kind of part of their national working plan. And then they set, due to a lawsuit from Center for Biological Diversity, a date to get that listing decision finalized, the proposal. So that was December 12th, just before the holidays, about 6 weeks ago. That proposed listing came out in the Federal Register. This is where, again, you might have seen this in the news or heard about it. And it does include, as the petitioners recommended, that the monarch qualifies for threatened, not endangered, because there's some distinction in the protections that threatened versus endangered listings have. And if it's threatened, it can have something called a 4D rule. So it's a little bit of technical terminology that I'll break down on the next slide. But it kind of followed, I think, some of the overview of what the petitioners had originally set out to recommend. So now we're in the public comment period. It's 90 days, which is nice. So you still have quite a bit of time if you want to submit public comments. So it ends on March 12th, and you can go to regulations.gov and you can submit your own comment. There's already about 10,000 public comments. So good luck reading everyone's public comments to date. But that's great. We're hearing a lot of people, have their voices heard, and it's an opportunity for you to, support what the service has proposed, to say, I think something should be different. Any sort of comments are welcome. And then they really highly recommend people try to back up any of their, recommendations with as much evidence as possible. So based on kind of the statutory length of this process, 12 months later, we should get a final decision. Sometimes this can take a lot longer. So we're just putting a little asterisk by that the soonest we would see a final decision from the service would be December of 2025 at the end of this year. And then there's usually a 30-day grace period before regulations take effect. So we're really looking at a year from now before there's any change in the law. And I think that's really important to hit home for folks who are kind of wondering how this affects them now. For the most part, this doesn't affect any kind of legal standing for the near term. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so you can go in and read the entire rule yourself. There's a lot of great information, and we've got some links on the next slide, but just an overview of some of the key takeaways, at least from my perspective. And again, kind of zooming into this technical term, 4D rule exemptions, which again is only available if it's listed as threatened, not endangered. This allows the service to carve out some more, what I would say, practical things that you can continue to do without fear of regulation if you accidentally harm or kill a monarch or remove its habitat. So some of those things that were exempted are routine agricultural activities: ranching, haying, plowing, vehicular strikes. If you hit a monarch with your car, that you're not going to face any regulatory consequences. And then other, ones that were really recommended by the petitioners, and we saw the service follow through with, which I think is a great relief to our, community scientists, is that handling and netting monarchs, tagging monarchs, testing for OE, all of that would still be allowed. It would even allow small scale captive rearing. I would like to really note that this does not supersede or override any state laws. And there are state laws in multiple states, including in Nevada and Washington, and then specifically for many of you in California. And so just knowing that this does not change those regulations, and it won't change those regulations. So you still have to follow whatever state regulations apply. And so for now in California, you can't even handle or net a monarch without a scientific collecting permit from CDFW. So just to be aware that that's kind of different and depends again on the state. Pesticides were not addressed, but were identified by the service as a key threat to monarchs, including herbicides and insecticides. So they explicitly asked the public for comment on how to address pesticides in their final listing. And then finally, again, of great interest to many of you who are out counting overwintering sites, they also proposed critical habitat for a subset of the California overwintering sites. Next slide, please. So if you're curious, there are maps in the proposed rule itself. So you can go again on the services website and see these static maps. They're pretty course level because they had to fit 62 of them onto this, but there is also a GIS file you can access if you want to pull this into your own data sets and understand where this habitat is. But in short, it's 62 overwintering sites. They used kind of quantitative metrics for determining which sites qualified. So you can read about the different cases in which a site would qualify, but it was largely based on the counts of the butterflies and how frequently the counts were over a certain threshold. So it does include really some of the largest sites, some of the sites most regularly occupied. It is only about a quarter of the total overwintering sites, but it is the sites that host the largest number of butterflies. So if you have comments or thoughts on what that threshold should be, if it should be higher or lower, I think that's a great place to public comment. There are 62 sites listed, including, I would say, 4 of the top 5 this year. So Pismo, Natural Bridges, Lighthouse Field, Moran Lake, which I didn't have on this list, but also were in there. SkyWest was not on here. So just noting this is not going to be perfect and catch every large site every year. Another big site frequently is Pacific Grove, which is also on there. And then there's quite a few public locations. And then notably Vandenberg Space Force Base got an exemption for being part of critical habitat, even though they did have sites that qualify. That's kind of a unique carve out for Department of Defense habitats from critical habitat. It's in total less than 5,000 acres being proposed. So when you think about the range in the lower 48 states of the monarch, this is less than 5,000 acres are being proposed as critical habitat. And importantly, especially when we get these questions from private landowners where there may be an intersection here, critical habitat does not change access or land ownership rights. But it is an extra layer of legal protection, in particular if there's a federal nexus. So if someone was applying for a federal grant, needed a federal permit, or federal funding was going to impact, let's say, removal of monarch habitat, that this would be an extra lens in which the service would consider any actions and would hopefully provide a lot more protection to those sites. But it does not mean that the listing is just applying to critical habitat. And that distinction, I think, is one that's a little bit more nuanced. So this does not mean that other overwintering sites would have no protection, but it may not have this extra layer that critical habitat offers. So we really recommend, if anyone has site-specific legal questions, to reach out to your local Fish and Wildlife Service office to ask those questions about what this would mean if the proposed ruling was finalized and how that might impact any plans you have in terms of management. And then there's some really great language in there as well about exemptions where if somebody is following a service approved management plan, that any of their activities are then exempt. So there is a way for people to kind of holistically plan, do a site management plan, and then have regulatory assurance that if they're implementing that plan, that they're following the law. So again, reach out to the service if you have questions about any management plans in the works or planned at any overwintering site. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So here's a few links. I know it's kind of hard to copy down, or if you don't have time to screenshot these detailed links, just go to fws.gov/monarch and you'll see this page that I have up here in this image. This has links to everything, but there's a lot to wade through. So I also just wanted to give people kind of the direct links to the rule, which again has those maps and the list of all the sites included in critical habitat. There's some really nice FAQs if you're a private landowner, if you are a rights of way manager, if you're an agricultural producer, and also if you're interested more in critical habitat. And then there's also that GIS layer that you can download. And it is both the overwintering site boundaries that you see on Xerces interactive map, plus a 500-foot buffer that the service has proposed to be added. So yeah, check that out and just know that it's not going to match completely what you might see on Xerces interactive map. Next slide, please. Great. And then finally, you can join that 10,000 comment list that's going, or if you want to maybe spend a little bit less time on regs.gov, you can sign. Xerces is just launching this today. It's on new mode. We have a QR code, or you can take that URL in the lower right. But it's, in short, a quick form, a quick sign-on letter that then Xerces will submit before the 12th on behalf of all the signatories to voice our support for the listing. And then we also have a 2-page letter attached that you can read that kind of goes into the pieces of the proposal that we think are really strong and we commend the service for and would like to see continue in the final rule. And then a few areas, particularly around pesticides and some other topics that you can read about and see, if you agree that you can sign on, or again, go ahead and, submit your own comment. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's it for Endangered Species Act updates. Again, reach out to the service if you have specific questions, but I'm just going to kick off this section with one slide about some of our science initiatives and then pass it over to my colleague, Sarah. So for those who have heard of this before, about 1.5 years ago, we formed this loose group that's called the Western Monarch Overwintering Science Initiative. Feel free to reach out to us if you have a research project or idea. This is kind of an evolving, amorphous, and wonderful collaborative group where we're trying to tackle some of the key knowledge gaps that we have at overwintering sites, which have been historically really understudied compared to the rest of the research that's gone into monarch work nationwide and internationally. So there are 3 really great projects that were happening in the field this year. So I've got a photo from each one. We could spend a lot of time on each of these because I think they're all really cool and hopefully we're going to just learn a lot in the coming years because of all of these studies. But on the far left, we have our scientist, Ashley Fisher, along with scientists from Point Blue Conservation Service and Southern Sierra Research Center, putting up a MODIS tower or a telemetry tower on Vandenberg Space Force Base this past fall. This has been part of expanding the MODIS network, which is run by Birds Canada to track migratory animals. Most famously, and 10 years running for birds, it's now expanding as tags get smaller and lighter for bats and even some migratory insects. So we're interested in working with others who are testing the viability of these tags on monarchs in the East and the West and in Canada. We're seeing early successes. We're really hopeful, and we had planned to do some tagging at Vandenberg this year, but because of the incredibly low numbers, scaled back our plans and then started focusing on increasing infrastructure, both at Dangermond Preserve and at Vandenberg Space Force Base in Point Conception, which have large overwintering colonies, and then working with state partners across the West to retrofit towers and kind of get us ready so that as more tagging happens in the future, we have the infrastructure up and running to pick up those tags. In the center, we have a great study by USGS, by Jay Diffendorfer and Peter Ibsen, and that's in partnership with Cal Poly and Xerces and Althouse and Mead and others to get monitors out at some of the key overwintering sites. This year, they had to really pivot and focus on sites that had large numbers. So they were at Pismo, they were up in Santa Cruz at a lot of the Santa Cruz sites. So thanks to all the partners that made that pivot possible and putting up these sensors to better understand some of the environmental factors and then look more holistically at fire risk over time. And this photo is actually from Sarah Quadra Vargas on our team putting out a monitor at Lower Topanga right before actually the Palisades fire affected this site, which she'll talk about in a minute. But kind of fortuitous timing that we were able to get some sensor data out there and when we're talking about fire risk. So that study is just in its first year, but we expect publications from that in the coming years. And then the final photo of a lot of people in safety vests. This is Kyle Nesson, who is a graduate student at Cal Poly and works for Althouse and Mead and some of his colleagues. And then Stephanie Little with State Parks in the Oceano Dunes, where Pismo State Beach, allowed folks to come in and fly a drone. You definitely have to get a lot of permissions to fly a drone at state park. So just noting that. But you see the drone down below, and this drone really allowed capture of LiDAR footage to better map the canopy structure as Kyle's research focuses on understanding what's unique about individual groves. And he's got kind of twin study areas over at Vandenberg Space Force Base as well. So Kyle is wrapping up his master's this year. And again, we hope to see publications to better understand grove structure and microclimate. And with that, we'll just say thanks to all the folks that are helping support these different science initiatives, and we'll continue to try to communicate results as they come forward in the next few years. And I'll pass it on to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Okay, so really great research going on at our overwintering sites, but unfortunately, not all events this year were celebratory. The Palisades, Eaton, and Hughes fires, among others, affected Southern California in early through mid-January, causing unprecedented destruction among the Pacific Palisades, Altadena, and Castaic. This included damage to habitat in Los Angeles County, including an overwintering site in Lower Topanga Canyon. So this photo here captures the area around Topanga Canyon Park, and you can see that some of the trees are still standing. I will also add that a monarch count was conducted at the site a week prior to the fire happening. We were doing our late season count of monarchs, and we did not find any monarchs. We suspect that overwintering monarchs were likely not directly affected by the Palisades fire. And Xerces staff has been working closely with state parks, the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains, and consultant biologists to plan for post-fire restoration of the overwintering site. And this abrupt and intense fire that affected the areas around Los Angeles just illustrate overwintering grove's vulnerability to extreme weather events and extreme events caused by climate change. And this photo was taken by our partner, Noah Roche Kilili with California State Parks. So I'd like to shift focus to volunteer and partner participation in the Western Monarch Count this year. So starting with our overwintering workshop. So this year, several Western Monarch workshops were hosted across California. Jessica Griffiths and Karis Vanderhyde, along with the Wildlife Society Western chapter, hosted an overwintering workshop for professional biologists in Central California. Isis Howard and Mia Monroe held several workshops for Pacific Gas and Electric staff up in the Bay Area. Isis Howard and Mia Monroe also hosted a workshop on Mare Island with the Solano Resource Conservation District. And then down here in Southern California, I hosted a workshop with overwintering land managers. So we were pretty busy this season. And I just wanted to kind of talk about our volunteer stats. It's always interesting to look at the numbers and this is something fun that our team likes to do, but we had over 400 volunteers and partners participate in the Western Monarch Count this overwintering season. Every year, this number grows and grows, and we're so excited to engage so many people. And over 1,000 Monarch Count surveys were submitted. The first counts were submitted by Kendra B. and Fiona R. And the 1,000th survey was submitted by Peggy B. So shout out to Kendra B., Fiona R., and Peggy B. for submitting all of those counts. And just to give you like a little bit of perspective as to like how much time is dedicated by our volunteers and partners. So we have approximately 1,700 hours logged for monarch counts alone. So that equates to 212 8-hour shifts, so 212 full-time shifts. And I just want to say that that number only captures the time that's going into surveys, but we also have regional coordinators leading trainings. We have docents who are working on behalf of land managers, such as this gentleman here at Pismo Beach Butterfly Grove, who dedicate their time to educate the public on Western monarchs. So we really appreciate all of the time that folks give to this initiative. And I just wanted to share some photos that were submitted to us. So we have some photos of our Pismo Beach Butterfly Monarch Grove docents in blue represented. We also have a photo of Belle Beth and Diana Magor at Lighthouse Field in Santa Cruz. And this like stunning photo by Seth Patel. And then also we introduced some new monarch flag thanks to ISIS, just so that our volunteers and partners are more identifiable in the field when they're conducting surveys. So thank you for submitting these photos. They're gorgeous. And then I also wanted to just like shout out our partners and volunteers who submitted the most counts this year. So you'll see some familiar names, but we have Kendra B, our own Mia Monroe, WMC co-founder and regional coordinator, Jessica Griffiths, San Luis Obispo regional coordinator. We have Alex S, Liz S, Jordan C, Karis Vanderhyde, Santa Barbara regional coordinator, Susan Ramos, Alameda County regional coordinator, Kathleen C. And then the person who submitted the most counts this year is Fiona R. So shout out to Fiona R. Really putting in work. Again, like, thank you so much for all of the work that you all do. And I wanted to show a few more photos. So many photos, so many beautiful photos, but we have some more photos of folks at Pismo Beach. We have student volunteers at UC Giltrakt with Susan Ramos, volunteers at Mare Island with Michael Kwong, and California Climate Action Fellows from CSU Northridge Institute for Sustainability. So we love seeing you all in the field wearing your swag and dedicating all of those hours to counting Western monarchs. And also special thanks to our regional coordinators, all of the folks on this screen here. These folks are supporting all of our volunteers, the 400 volunteers that we had. So thank you so much for all of your dedication. We cannot do this work without the support of our regional coordinators. And with that, speaking of which, this is a good time to hear a few words of wisdom from our own Mia Monroe. So Mia Monroe is the original Western Monarch Count coordinator and co-founder, and she's been a conservationist and community mentor. She's a mentor and a huge inspiration to our team at Xerces. She began surveying overwintering monarchs way back in 1981. And thanks to Mia's amazing dedication over the years, monarch conservation efforts have continued to gain traction. So yeah, I just wanted to invite Mia to speak with us. And Mia, if you can just say a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go into our questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Isis and Emma. And it's such an honor to be associated as a Xerces Society volunteer. And for me, I truly can say monarch butterflies have been a lifetime passion. I grew up just south of San Francisco and would greet my grandmother arriving on the train. And while we were awaiting its arrival, I would look at milkweed for caterpillars and eagerly awaited our trips to Pacific Grove each fall to see the overwintering clusters there. So it wasn't surprising when the National Park Service received an invitation to participate in Western Monarch inventory that as a young ranger at Muir Woods, I raised my hand and said, can I help with this inventory? And that really formalized my awareness of the importance of tracking the monarchs as they arrived and clustered and taking peeks at the sites. And I also became aware that we needed to do it on an ongoing basis. But to me, the incredible part of this has been the community science volunteer aspect, which is just such an important component, being a volunteer. I also feel compelled to say that my mother was very inspired when I was a child by Rachel Carson, and as she made the link between pesticides and the dwindling, what we now would call biodiversity of our wild things throughout North America, our government stepped up to pass laws and guidelines and in my own lifetime, I've seen the recovery of such species as peregrine falcons, thanks to those people stepping up to help another species recover. So that was really motivating for me to be an activist and to be a conservationist and to pay close attention.
Awesome. Thank you for that background, Mia. And yeah, we're going to ask Mia a few questions. So we'll start with the first. Mia, what are your thoughts on this year's numbers, given your longer term perspective on annual monitoring of the Western monarch overwintering population?
Well, first, the numbers are dismal and depressing. But as a longtime monitor, they're not entirely surprising because for years we've been documenting the downward trends. But also, I am really so gratified at the increasing number of volunteers engaged as monitors, community scientists, and also how we are checking more sites more regularly throughout the season. And what this means for me is that all those monitors that you cited, Sarah, we are firsthand witnesses, and we can powerfully share what this decline in the migration and overwintering phenomena means. We are firsthand witnesses. We know what it means to see fewer and fewer monarchs and to see diminishment of the overwintering sites. And that means our involvement grows as we add more count periods, as we work with landowners and public agencies, and we share with many what they can do to help monarchs. We're very passionate, and I have to really comment that Xerces transparency and access to data and information is very rewarding for us volunteers. I've been thinking a little bit about my slightly different feelings to the 2020 precipitous decline and such low numbers and the existential crisis I felt at that time, which I still feel. But I do feel like the response was so amazing to look at the data gaps, to really accelerate the amount of science, the support to land managing agencies. So I kind of feel like there's so much professional caring and this overwhelming support by community science that I feel kind of different. I feel like it's been rewarding watching the response.
Great. Thank you, Mia. And what are your hopes for the state of the Western monarch population? And also, what are your concerns?
Well, first, I truly hope that there's monarchs at overwintering sites for all of us monitors to actually go and count. It's really makes a difference when there's monarchs to see. But I truly have a passionate dream of a recovering wild monarch population that again inhabits the West in the millions that I once knew, so that I can again see them fluttering in mountain meadows or in my neighbors' gardens, or I can invite families to go again to coastal California to stand in awe among the clusters. So I truly feel like I wish the wild monarchs will recover. And I also know that if the wild monarchs recover, it means a healthier world, a much more biologically diverse world. And I just really also wish that the experience of being among monarchs is again available to kids and to the peoples throughout the West. There's nothing like seeing a monarch.
Great. And can you share some good things that are happening in your area related to the conservation of Western monarchs?
Well, thanks for giving me this moment to give a shout out for the some things that are right here in my area. And I know that these stories represent incredible other experiences people are having throughout California. But in the San Francisco Bay region, our volunteer corps has grown to include real special experiences, like the students at Giltrakt Farm in Albany, which is actively enhancing one of this year's most popular sites through the implementation of a modified building plan, several years of Xerces plant kits, and an active riparian revegetation that the students are undertaking, as well as monitoring for the effect on the monarch site. And then there's the Monarch Bay Golf Course, which we used to be known as the San Leandro Golf Course, and they renamed it to acknowledge their commitment to protecting that area for monarchs. One thing that's been really rewarding is watching the attention given to Mare Island in Solano County. The RCD there led up the team this year, and they welcomed a far-flung team of volunteers from at least 3 different counties who all wanted to participate. And then, of course, my home county, Marin, we were checking out 3 sites where land owners and agencies are taking steps to improve the sites, and there were monarchs fluttering at all of them. So that was very, very rewarding for me.
So good to hear about all these positive things. Okay, so to wrap up, what is something that you'd like the public to know about Western monarch conservation?
Well, I just want to echo what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said twice, that no one waited to be told to get busy to help monarchs, and that there's something that everyone can do, whether you are a home gardener, a school, a public land agency, PG&E even. There's something everybody can do to help take care of monarchs, and everybody is busy to doing it. So I encourage everyone to find what they can offer to help monarchs have a healthy world and recover, and then step it up a little bit. But also, I realize that this has to happen on a larger landscape level. So just supporting the wider efforts is really, really important too. My final thought is that watching and seeing just a single monarch, just my spirit soars, and there is hope. And of course, take a picture with it on iNat. Keep track no matter what.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you for your knowledge, and thank you so much for paving the way in the Western Monarch Count and just being an advocate for Western monarchs. We wouldn't be here holding this webinar if it weren't for all of your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be a volunteer with Xerces Society and participate in this count. It really makes a difference, and it's a way we can all actively participate.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you all are ever in Marin in the Bay Area and you hear about this monarch butterfly lady, that's Mia, and you may be able to meet her at an overwintering site.
Please do.
Awesome. Thank you, Mia. Alrighty. So I love that Mia talked about iNaturalist and how folks can get involved. So you're probably thinking, what's next? What can you do outside of the overwintering season? So, okay, due to this year's low monarch numbers, we are especially interested in the movement of monarchs away from overwintering sites and back to breeding states. So you can help us track Western monarchs by downloading iNaturalist onto your smartphone if you don't have it already, and uploading photos of monarchs onto the app and tagging the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project. You can do this while walking your dog, hanging out in your garden, going on a hike with your friends, etc. So this data is shared with the public and may be used among researchers, similar to the Western Monarch Count. So if you're not involved with this already, go ahead and add the project to your iNaturalist. And if you are instead observing monarchs using blooming plants for nectar, we have a database for that too. So this tool was developed in Survey 123 and is aimed at capturing monarch nectar data across the US. So this includes Western and Eastern monarchs. So even if you're traveling east of the Rocky Mountains, you can log your observations into this database. So with this data, Xerces builds nectar plant lists that are unique to each state. And I will go ahead and drop the link to that survey in the chat for you all. Awesome. And we're coming to the end here, guys. Okay, so habitat kit applications are also open soon. So this is another great tool to increase native monarch and pollinator habitat all around you. Xerces will provide plants and resources free of charge. You have to commit to planting the kit and caring for it. With that, you will contribute to creating habitat for our native pollinator species by introducing flowery plants into your space. So we have several habitat kit programs, with those in California focused on working lands, but this year we're including 2 new kits. So we have a new overwintering site kit and a new Southern California residential kit that is targeted towards residential gardens, like home gardens. But we also have kits available in Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, Wisconsin, Detroit, Michigan, and the Mid-Atlantic. So you can go to xerces.org/habitat-kits to learn more. These applications should be opening in February. And with that, we'd like to make some acknowledgements. So the Western Monarch Count is made possible by hundreds of dedicated volunteers and partners who collected data at overwintering sites, as well as funding from the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, California Wildlife Conservation Board, Elizabeth Weber, the Maxwell Hanaron Foundation, Monarch Joint Venture, Nature Path Foods, San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, the Taggart Saxon Schubert Fund, U.S. Forest Service International Programs, and Xerces Society members. Thank you so much. And we have to add this in here, but if you would like to join the movement, the work that we do depends on everyone. So you can make a difference for invertebrates that you love by becoming a Xerces member today, if it is within your means. So you can visit xerces.org/donate and support the work that we're doing for Western monarchs, but also pollinators and all other invertebrates that require conservation by us humans. And with that, we will shift over to some Q&A. And I'll hand that over to Isis.
Thank you, Sarah, for wrapping up the webinar, and thank you, Mia and Emma, for sharing your knowledge and expertise as well. We got a number of questions in the Q&A box, so we're going to be starting to go through some of those now, and we are running past our 12 o'clock hour mark, so if anyone has to leave, again, we will be posting the recording of this webinar to westernmonarchcount.org, and so you can find that there as well. But if you do have any remaining questions, please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them, or if not, you can always email us at wmc@xerces.org. Okay, so I'm going to let's start with the fires question. So Patrick Myers is wondering if there's a lot of mortality from the wildfires. And so Sarah or Emma, I don't know if you want to chime in on this, but what I can say right off the bat is that luckily, this year was such a low overwintering population year that the sites that were impacted were not hosting a large number of butterflies anyways, less than 10 at most of the sites near active fires. But I'll pass this off to Sarah since she's a local to Southern California.
Thanks, Isis. Yes, and I would agree. So the Lower Topanga site is the one site that we know for sure was damaged in the fires. And we did not find any monarch butterflies there prior to the fire. This occurred during our late season count. So we're not aware of any direct mortality of monarchs in Los Angeles County due to the fires, but there are going to be more long-term effects on the habitat. So it will take some time for us to recover and restore the habitat so that monarchs, so that the habitat is suitable for monarchs to overwinter there in future seasons. And Emma, do you have anything to add?
I think you covered that well, Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is from Dejeen May. I am so sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. But they're asking, are there specific conservation measures that we can take to help buffer the effects of drought and high temperature on monarchs? Emma, would you mind taking this one on?
Sure thing. Yeah. Thanks, Dejan. Great question. I think this is definitely going to be at the top of all of our minds. And I do think some of the research that's been emerging from Department of Defense legacy work by Washington State University and UC Davis suggests that monarch caterpillars do better when there's some amount of shade. And it's a little bit of a balancing act because milkweed doesn't do well in an all shade environment. But having them near shade where there's kind of cooler microclimates can be really important. So that work, especially in the arid West, has really shown, I think, a take home that we can talk to people about it. Like if you're deciding where to prioritize habitat restoration or habitat protection, trying to prioritize areas that are in those cooler microclimates, near water, near shade, are ways that we think we can make an impact. And then potentially thinking about, the more important breeding grounds might be shifting north, might be shifting to areas that are a little less prone to those really hot temperatures. And it could depend on the year. This was an extreme year. Climate change is going to make these more likely, but that doesn't mean that areas that weren't great at producing monarchs late in the summer this year aren't going to be next year. So again, just like more habitat in more places and thinking about that resiliency and redundancy, I think is really important.
Isis, you're muted.
Oops. Okay, thank you. So I've got a few more questions for Emma. So this one may or may not be a question for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but Julie Beer is asking what protections are afforded to a threatened species versus a endangered species when determined on the ESA.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this does come down to the nuance and species specific regulations, but in general, an endangered species is going to be afforded a higher level of protection. But that's really species specific. It's not that automatically changes, what the laws are. So it's really kind of details are in the rules of any one species, but what is unique and that we've tried to point out here is that, if something is listed as endangered, it cannot have that 40 rule where you can kind of carve out broad scale exemptions. I didn't talk a little bit about like forestry and silviculture practices in the breeding zone right now is also proposed for exemption. So if monarchs have been listed as endangered, which I don't think any of us think they qualify for, but if they had been, those broad scale exemptions would not have been possible. And as well as like the handling piece, you don't often see that. That's kind of unique in general. And that's just likely because monarchs are so kind of ingrained in how we interact with wildlife. But if it had been listed as endangered, that sort of carve out exemption would not have been possible. So it does really depend, but overall it's very species specific.
And along those same lines, an anonymous attendee was asking, are all of the top 2024 overwintering sites included in the proposed critical habitat locations? And I believe they are, but
I'll double check. I think if Skywest Golf Course, I have to double check. I'll try to look at that now and get back to folks in the chat with that one.
cool. Thank you, Emma. To give Emma a little break, I can answer a question from Jessica Garden asking about how school systems can get more involved because when they were a kid, they saw lots of public service announcements like Smokey the Bear or Woodsy Owl, and wondering if there needs to be like additional folks spreading awareness about this. And what I'll say is yes, all the awareness that our communities can raise across North America is really critical. So monarchs are native to North America and they span the habitats, between Canada, United States, and Mexico, and they don't discriminate between rural or suburban or urban settings. They can possibly use it all. So I do recommend, if you're interested in monarch butterflies or they have a special place in your heart, please do get engaged. And we have a number of ways to do that on xerces.org. I think we have a section called Get Involved, and we have some free resources called X Kids. Xerces Kids. It's a booklet geared for 3rd through 5th graders. And if you have the funds to print out the booklets are available to you in Spanish language and English language. And they have a number of activities that meet grade criteria for 3rd through 5th graders again. So I really recommend checking out our X Kids booklets. And then if the schools have the ability to plant a pollinator garden, a hands-on experience like that can be a really great way to learn by doing at a young age. And you'll not only see monarch butterflies, but you'll see so many other pollinators that are attracted to milkweed plants or nectar plants arriving in your garden. And you can even get involved in community science, like posting those pictures on iNaturalist. So these are all like many fun ways for schools to get involved. All right, so Lainey Rather Weymouth is asking if there's any future plans for creating workshops along the East Coast. And what I'll say is that our team presenting here today is focused on Western monarch butterflies, but our colleague Ray Morans and other Xerces employees focused on pollinator conservation and pesticide regulation are stationed on the East Coast. So if you are on the East Coast and interested in getting involved, please stay tuned at xerces.org by looking at our events page, and we'll post things that are open to the public there. All right, this is another question for Emma probably, but Radhika Nikem is wondering what the reason for the low numbers in 2020 was and where can they find more info comparing that to subsequent years?
Great. Yeah, great question. And it was very much the big question back in 2020 and 2021. So that Bounciness of Butterflies blog that Isis connected you all to earlier in the presentation can be a great source of that. And we can drop that in the chat along with our announcement back from that year. But it was an unusually warm fall and early winter. So we do think in that case, part of the reasons the numbers were so low is that some of the monarchs switched strategies, and we saw a huge uptick of breeding in the East Bay in particular. We also just know that, there was a recovery that happened the next year, and it could have been in part by good luck or a series of fortunate events, as Louis Yang at UC Davis coined it. And it also could have been the fact that Eastern and Western monarchs are not completely separate, and that in the breeding grounds, in particular, Intermountain states, Arizona, New Mexico, there could be an influx, and the numbers in Mexico that year were relatively high. So there could have been kind of a saving of the population the next winter because of that intermixing from Eastern monarchs. So I think what we're a little more concerned about this year is, while the numbers aren't out from World Wildlife Fund Mexico, anecdotes from, the overwintering grounds in Mexico say that it's going to be a very low year. So we have a very low year in Mexico and a very low year in California. So kind of how that plays out, we may not have that kind of population bump that we had. However, the Eastern population is much, much, much larger. So even a small proportion of the butterflies joining Western monarchs, can kind of exponentially increase the population over time. So it kind of goes into the crazy math of how butterflies have, 4+ generations a year, and then weather dictates kind of what they're able to do. So we do see some wild swings, and any one year's wild swing we've got a lot of questions about, but I think when we zoom out, that overall trend continues to be the same and continues to be the focus of our conservation efforts. Of like, we can't always affect the weather, but we can affect, addressing climate change slowly and surely, pesticide risks, and then that habitat piece are really key.
Thank you, Emma. And Julie Beer is wondering if, okay, let's see here. She's wondering if some Western monarchs have been shifting to new lower population locations. She says, I'm no monarch expert, but I know they can be confused with, and I know they can be confused with similar butterfly species, but I've seen several possible monarchs around Rinconada Park in Palo Alto, and they've swum there for about 40 years and never remembered seeing them there in previous years. What I can say to this, Julie, is that there are a small handful of new sites added to the Western Monarch Count surveys every year because of people's observations like yours. So, um, it's not a significant number of new sites, but we do add a few each year. And so you can see that represented on our data sheet. When we find new clustering locations, we add them. Some years don't have any new sites, but some years have 1, 2, 3, etc. And part of this is because the awareness is spreading and more people are looking for monarch butterflies. And so they observe them and then they report them either through INAT or through word of mouth. And it gets to some monarch expert somewhere. And we send our volunteers out to go survey the site. And this is really important. And also because monarchs in the West overwinter along the coastline, a lot of these properties are private. So sometimes we are facing access barriers or obstacles. And so the more we spread the word and get people aware and on board for monarch conservation, we hope that we can continue surveying more robustly. That said, in the Bay Area, there are some resident monarchs that breed year round because the climate nowadays is so temperate, and so it and mild that it allows milkweed to be available year round, and sometimes tropical milkweed and now native milkweeds aren't dying back as early or at all during the winter season, which allows monarchs to continue sticking around as a breeding population. So we see that a little bit in the Bay Area and a little bit in Southern California, which also might explain some of the activity. Um, Denise is asking why there isn't more emphasis on management control and permitting procedures for pesticides on agricultural lands close to California overwintering sites. Tough one. But Emma, I don't know if you might want to take a stab at this.
Yeah, great question. And if folks didn't see it, we didn't spend time on it today, but there was a great blog by our colleague, Xerces Society, that you can find that came out last week about a mortality incident that happened in January of 2024 at Pacific Grove. And thanks to the city and museum and docents there, we believe that there was an acute poisoning incident. So absolutely was an example that hit home where pesticides are impacting, overwintering sites, not just in their breeding and migratory range. That was reported to the Monterey Ag Commissioner. They did an investigation and did not find any registered uses near that particular incident. So, a lot of these sites are kind of in an urban or, more of a forested natural setting. We don't have as many sites heavily in ag, although we do have some. So I think in that case, for sure, it kind of just underlined that it's not just agricultural pesticide use that's a problem. We think in that specific case, it probably was kind of an unreported or unregistered, private or company application, even structural application. So just hitting it home that like we all have a responsibility, and that often the people applying it in like residential areas are even less, informed of the risks or qualified. So what you can buy at Home Depot is, very different than, what somebody who's undergone training and has more of a format and way to report. So just with that big caveat that it's not just about ag, I think the ag piece is big. And I do think that's where you can read our public comment letter, where we want to really emphasize that, of course, we need, pesticides for certain human health and food production reasons, but there's a lot of pesticide use we can think about, reducing, and we can think about, how do we focus on limiting these impacts, not just for monarchs, but heavily associated with butterfly declines across the US. So we know pesticides are a big one. They're a hard one. They can be a controversial one, but they're an important one to consider, and just emphasize that is definitely going to be a focus of our comments of trying to guide the service in how to strike that balance.
Thank you, Emma. That was really well said. And Sarah has put the link to that blog in the chat if you want to pull that. And we are going to close Q&A now, but we so appreciate all of you who attended. And again, for those who missed it, this will be recorded and posted to westernmonarchcount.org within the next week, and I'll send it out on our constant contact emails, which are the like colorful emails that we send out to anyone signed up to the Western Monarch Count e-newsletter. So if you aren't already signed up and want to keep tabs this season and then in the future, you can sign up for our e-newsletter at westernmonarchcount.org. And again, we don't send weekly emails or anything like that throughout the year. We just send our email updates during the overwintering season or the month prior when we're gearing up our volunteers. So I promise I won't spam you too much, only during the overwintering season when there's lots of good updates coming out. And yeah, so with that, we're going to close out, but thank you all for attending. Thank you, Mia, for agreeing to be a speaker with us. Thank you, Emma and Sarah, and everyone who's volunteered or supported this project. Take care, everyone.